Welcome to 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. Virtual Pilgrimage. My name is John Borthwick, and I've been encouraging the community that I serve to journey with me through the book 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph over the past number of months. We started way back at the end of September, and so if this is the first time you're catching us for this virtual pilgrimage, number one, get the book. Find the book, get the book, order the book from your local bookseller, and give it a read. If you want a reading companion or a part of a reflection journey of it, the virtual pilgrimage is what that's all about. So if this is the first time you're seeing me talk about this book, you need to go back, because we have done 23 videos already of these reflections of the book as we went through the 21 things. Now, today is the final video, and one of the pieces I want to illustrate is, we're doing this kind of thing. We're through half the book, which is great, but we've got another half to go. So that's an interesting way of designing the book. 21 things exist within the first half. The second half is essentially about, well, if not this, then what? If not the Indian Act, then what? A bit of a reflection on that, and also some excellent resources, which I'd highly recommend. So, how do we get from here and go from here to something else? Today might be a touch longer. We'll see how we do as we navigate through this last reflection. So Bob's title for this section of the book is If Not the Indian Act, Then What? Probably if you've been reading through it, if we've been walking through it together, you may have felt or seen or wondered, well, if not the Indian Act, then what can we do? We've seen how the government has repealed parts of it, edited parts of it, changed parts of it, added to it. And so if the Indian Act didn't exist, what would this look like? How would it be? How could we improve upon it? What would be a better situation? And also from last week, you'll remember that when there was an attempt to do something different, it wasn't well received by the Indigenous community. And in a typical white supremacist kind of way of seeing things, the lasting aftertaste of that experience was kind of like, well, okay, then, here we are trying to help you out, and now, okay, if you don't want that, then stay where you're at, which is always so very helpful. Somehow, the people doing the work or working on the white paper from way back when, and a white paper, they take offense to the fact that people just don't want what they're offering. And we'll get to a teaser or a touch of what that thing they're offering is really about, and why, again, it's not satisfactory. So he starts this section of the book with a quote from Ovid McCurdy, the former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations in 1993, and this is what Ovid says. I'm often asked whether it would be better to change the existing Indian Act or to eliminate it entirely. Will we still need the Indian Act once our right to self-government is recognized and our treaties are implemented? I believe we will need some federal legislation to make clear the obligations of the federal government bears toward First Nations peoples. This is radically different from an Indian Act that continues to allow a minister and some bureaucrats to tell people who they are, what they can do, or how they must live. That arrangement is a colonial relic. We would all like to see it disappear, but we would like to see the government fulfill its responsibilities to us, not shirk them by repealing the Indian Act and pretending that is the end of their obligations to First Peoples. So we've heard this a lot, this idea of essentially, okay, well, we'll get rid of the Indian Act and then you can become just like everyone else. And there's something so problematic about that kind of mindset for a variety of reasons, and hopefully you've caught that through this journey, and if not, also check out Me and White Supremacy, that virtual pilgrimage as well. But when you think of it, after having over 100 years of legislation from the Government of Canada that has basically been so disruptive, so dysregulating and regulating of people's lives, undermining, holding back, generationally traumatizing, dehumanizing, and then the simple answer is, well, okay, then, hey, you're free. You're free to go. Go and do whatever you want. Enjoy your life. You don't need any more of this regulation on top of you. And we've heard so often that when the government has sought to offer something to Indigenous peoples, it was always with this piece of, well, you can have this, but you have to then relinquish your identity as Indian under the Indian Act, which was the only way, in some ways, the way this government has framed it, the only way that a person who is Indigenous can navigate the system in some way that has some benefits, but lots of deficits. So, as we journey through this part, there's some questions that one might want to consider around, where are these conversations heading? What kind of things would we be thinking about in this kind of experience? And what is it reminiscent of, or what does it bring up for us? For myself, I'm thinking about a couple of things that we've spoken about in a variety of different spaces, and maybe you've heard or percolated up as you've been thinking about this. But it seems to me it's in part conversations that we see globally and certainly in the United States of America around reparations. What does reparations look like? So the idea that something has to be offered, some kind of, whether it's a financial payment or a financial payment and other things as a part of it, need to be offered to a people who have basically been oppressed, victimized, traumatized, treated so horribly for generations, and all the impacts of that somehow a reparation has to happen. Because the other piece of this is, for some of us who look a little bit like me, there's always been a part of our journey, for most or many of us, there's been a part of our journey that is from the day from the day peoples like us walked off a boat and stepped onto this land we now call Canada. There's been a piece of you've had an extra bit. You've been able to move ahead. You've been able to take on something from the past that we took away, that we stole, that we benefited from by moving people on or committing horrible atrocities or cultural genocide or whatever the language you want to have. And so there's been this sense also, this conversation around generational wealth. So to simply say, hey, okay, the legislation's gone, we turn it off, just go and be like everybody else. It so dismisses the experience of the last 150 years or more, and certainly the last number of years related to just first contact and all that. And so part of this conversation needs to maybe include, what do reparations look like? What does the conversation around generational wealth into that mix look like? Now, again, Bob speaks to the fact that a lot of folks talk about, both within the government and people who are advocating for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples themselves, this conversation around self-government as an inherent right. And certainly that has been spoken about in a variety of different settings, and it's been important to name that. But it also comes up a little bit around a question around sovereignty. And for some in Canada, we might be percolating, something might be triggering even for some. When we hear the word sovereignty, we think of the province of Quebec and the whole conversation in that space. And it would seem that within the Indigenous community, this is also a thing. So the idea within many within the Indigenous community of, not only do we want to be able to self-govern, we also want to be recognized as a sovereign nation within a nation. And so it becomes this question of, how do you also allow for a sense of complete sovereignty of Indigenous peoples? What does that look like? And that could be a big part of a conversation as well. And obviously it's a lot of work, but that shouldn't stop us from starting the work or keeping the work going or moving it forward. Bob also acknowledges that a part of all this conversation needs to at least recognize that, getting self-government, moving in this direction, isn't necessarily just going to be a panacea or a silver bullet, as he phrases it. There's a lot to rebuild and to heal, but it's an important, very important step. There are so many things of social health and economic issues that are continuing to burden and plague Indigenous communities and peoples that we still need to do things about that as a part of this conversation. But certainly a step would be to remove the notion of being overseen or oppressed, or continue to have this challenge of government intervention within people's very lives, their day-to-day lives, who they are as a people, all those kinds of things. So thinking about that will be an important step as well. He reminds us again, as he's reflecting on all this, that, a part of this is this was done with intention. The Indian Act was put in place with a very specific purpose. And so moving beyond it is also going to need to be perceived or seen as, what specific purpose are we moving towards? What does self-governing look like outside of this thing called the Indian Act? What does self-reliance look like? What could self-sustainability look like for Indigenous peoples as well? Because we also have seen a lot of the way in which government and certainly corporate interests have cooperated, colluded, negotiated, made agreements with Indigenous communities across the country around resources and land. And some would say, well, they were given something as a part of the deal and the part of the negotiation. But we always need to treat, I think, that with a bit of suspicion of, yes, they were given something, but anytime a corporation, or even the government sometimes, gives you something, there's something else going on in the background. Something else bigger is happening. So yes, you might get your cut, and hopefully you're satisfied with that, and then someone else is going to make a lot more money, or a legacy of wealth, or have an ability to do more things because they were able to negotiate that part. And so maybe self-sustaining needs to be a part of how do people, Indigenous peoples, have a greater share, or the lion's share really, of the resource revenue or land revenues as a part of this experience. And we're seeing tidbits of that across the country in stories that you may be hearing, where Indigenous communities are now becoming the developer in a situation in places in large cities like Vancouver. The other thing that this percolates up for me is the conversation I said way back when in one of our earliest videos, the conversation around, for my ancestry, Scottish heritage, the interplay between Scotland and England, this kind of stuff. And when Scotland has talked about becoming self-governing, completely separating almost from England or the Great Britain, there's been this conversation around, well, the oil resources, just a tidbit, not to say that oil extraction is a good thing. There's a lot of stuff to work on there, just to say. But around oil extraction, well, that exists predominantly in Scottish waters. So that they're saying, well, we're going to have the full revenue from the oil extraction industry, which of course freaks out Great Britain because they depend on that. So these are the kind of questions that this idea of self-government, of sovereignty, self-reliance, all those kinds of things. It also it's going to raise up questions as well around, around self-determination. Who speaks for Indigenous communities? How collectively do they work towards this sovereignty and self-government? It can't have, as much as the government will want to, and as much as Canadian people will even advocate for, almost an imposed framework. That can't be the journey. It can't be an imposed framework from the government about this is how we want to navigate this. It needs to come from the Indigenous community as to what framework would work well as this long journey towards self-governance, sovereignty perhaps, a different framework and a different path forward for Indigenous peoples in this country happen, a big part of it. So if we can actually, and Bob reminds us of this as well, if we can actually as a country, as agencies, as a community, if we can actually stay committed to this conversation, and that's been a theme too, right? People want this just to be over. Can we just fix it? Can it just be done? And, I raised up Quebec. Lots of folks would say that. Can this conversation just be over? Can we carry on? And still, it raises its head every so often, and people are like, are we still talking about that? Yes, we need to still talk about some things that exist in our lives that don't just go away easily. And so he reminds us that if we can stay committed to the conversation, if we can stay focused on this idea of what would it look like if Indigenous peoples were a nation within a nation kind of relationship, what would that look like? How would that change the dynamics? And being committed to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 recommendations. Just do a quick scan of those. How many of those have actually been implemented? How many of those have actually been, can we check the box on any of those? It's not as many as we would hope for, since they were put out in 2015. There's still a lot more work to do. And I think it also speaks to us personally. What can we do? How do we continue to work on those things within our own personal lives? As a church, we've got some that are there, and there are some that we need to be thinking about still. Just recently, one of the 94 was that the Pope would apologize. Within a year was the ask in 2015. Well, it was good that the Pope came recently, but it was a long time coming. We see within the framework around education and talking about how we talk about our past and our history. We need to be consistent around apologies, around recognizing our act, our collusion with the government as a church. We need to be training up people who are doing theological education, becoming ministers, becoming leaders within church communities, that they are a part of that learning about the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada and the church's impact and abuse within all that story is a part of their learning, that it's embedded in their understanding of things. But beyond that, also having a better understanding and an openness to the spirituality of Indigenous peoples, to prevent more kinds of spiritual abuse and spiritual violence as we navigate this. And, many of our churches, the churches that ran residential schools, have certainly committed to funding and support. But even within our own denomination, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, I'm aware of and a part of conversations where we're discovering that those things aren't self-sustaining. How the Indigenous peoples who are working in those ministries to people across Canada are still having, in a way, a kind of very colonial relationship with the church as a whole. It's very much an ask. May we have some more? If it fits in this framework from this part of the body, then maybe you'll get some funding. So we're talking about what is sustainable funding, what is more input into how the funding is used, and visions for that need to be a big part of this. Last thing I want to say, because if you're still with me, thank you. This has been a long one. There's some great terminology in the book that he ends with, and also several appendices that help you to learn a little more and see and even read various documents that he's referenced along the way. Near the back, near almost the end, there's a piece around a personal, professional pledge of reconciliation. And as I end this reflection, and as I end this virtual pilgrimage, I might invite you to think about this for yourself. Copy this out of the book. I'll read it out loud for myself as my own personal pledge of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. But maybe reflect on this for yourself and get the book. Read the 94 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And then here's what an example pledge might look like, and let me express this myself. I, John Borthwick, in the spirit of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada, solemnly pledge to learn more about Indigenous peoples and issues, to continue to look forward to positive change for the situation of Indigenous peoples, and to find ways to address the Indigenous-related myths and misconceptions with my fellow Canadians, to not perpetuate stereotypes in my conversations or observations, to encourage others around me to keep reconciliation an ongoing effort, to actively encourage ongoing support of National Indigenous Peoples Day every June 21st for myself, my family, my community, and my colleagues, and the day of observance for reconciliation as well in September. I would commit to that as well. I, John Borthwick, offer this personal pledge. So today, as we wrap up our virtual pilgrimage through the 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act, I invite you to think of ways that you can personally pledge your commitment to continuing this conversation in the spaces that you occupy. Thank you so very much for joining me on this virtual pilgrimage. I wish you well, and may we see a different, a new, a Canada that embraces all people and learns from each other and can thrive together, acknowledging our past, addressing the significant reality of our present, and seeing a future that looks a lot different than all those things. Thank you.